Do you have bad quilting habits? I know I do. Bad habits are something that we do now to make our lives easier, but pay a price for it in the long term. Some of them are at the expense of our work, our spaces, and our mental health. Here are 8 bad habits that I had and why I fixed them. So stick with me and I'll show you how to do it. Hi, I'm Karen Brown of Just Get It Done Quilts. I give you tips, tricks, and strategies to help you make the quilt that you want to make. And if you like what you see, please click that subscribe button. Habits are behaviors that we do over and over again. Some we do because it's the easy choice in the moment, but some have long-term outcomes that are less than ideal. Over the years, I've had to change some of my quilting habits to get the final results that I want. And this is by no means all the bad habits that I have, but I'm going to limit myself to 8 here. When I used to have loose threads, I ignored them, thinking that I would snip it later when the quilt was done. Choosing not to snip for me was more about losing momentum. Stopping, finding a needle, threading it, burying the threads was just too fussy. The problem was, when I got to the end of the project, I wasn't too motivated to snip them then either. Not burying your threads leaves an unfinished look to your work, and they might fray later. James Clear, in his book Atomic Habits, says that if you want to make a new habit, you need to make it easy. So when I discovered self-threading needles, I saw that this was the tool that I needed to change my ways. Because the thread just slips in here, there's not much fiddling. Now I keep one with a pair of snips everywhere, beside my sewing machine, in my Sew on the Go kit, one on the front and the back of my long arm, and in my new sew caddy, to make it fast and easy to bury those threads as I go along. Coming from garment sewing, I quickly realized that there was a number of techniques that I had to do differently in quilting. Pre-washing is not a necessity. I didn't need to match my thread color to my fabrics. And instead of pressing my seams open, I pressed them to the dark side. But it took me making a number of quilts before I realized that the habit of looking at my 1/4-inch seam and saying close enough was holding me back. Accuracy in your 1/4-inch seam is so important for your blocks to finish at the correct size, and then for all of them to be sewn together so that the quilt lies flat. So now, before I start any sewing session, I take a moment with some scrap pieces and I sew and press them to test that my guide is in the correct spot. Occasionally I get it right the first time, but normally it takes 2 to 3 adjustments and the occasional 4th to get the accuracy I want. I am so miserly with my fabric that I try to get every square inch out of it. And that means that I often leave too much of the selvage on, and that ends up in my work. Like, how stupid can I be? I put all this effort into choosing a good color layout, sewing accurately, and finding a quilt design that I like, only to find a strip of selvage in the middle of my finished quilt. Not only are selvages a different pattern and color, sometimes they're also woven differently so that they shrink differently too. So now, before I stack my fabrics and cut strips to make my piles, I trim those edges off first. Speaking of selvages, I know that there are makers who love making projects out of these strips. Some selvages have become so colorful, fun, and collectible over the last decade. So I saved them for years before I realized that I was never going to make anything from them. 1, I wasn't patient enough to wait for them to accumulate till I had enough to use. But 2, I didn't especially like the look of the finished product, so I decluttered them. And then I started looking at other things in my sewing space that I was never going to use. Little balls of wool, specialty rulers, old thread, patterns, and hard to believe, even some fabric. Every year in the Declutter Challenge, I find it gets easier. Because it's not a judgment
on whether things are good or bad. It's whether they're right for you.
Because life is too short to be making projects that don't bring you joy. It took me years to realize how valuable a label was. I thought my work wasn't good enough or valuable enough to be signed. And honestly, after I sew the binding on, I am so exhausted with the project that I have no momentum left to design a label, let alone sew one on. But the tipping point for me was my interview with Joanna Jermesian, who talked about the hundreds of thousands of World War II quilts that Canada donated to Europe during the war. And because they have no labels on them, very little is known about those makers, who they were, where they came from, and why they were making those quilt tops. And I realized that I wanted my quilts, no matter how scrappy or simple, to be part of my legacy. So now, instead of waiting to the end of a project when I'm exhausted, I make my label after the top is done and before I quilt it. That way I can use my scraps or an orphan block, and I can also sew it into the after quilt or sew it in with the binding. I also purchased these pre-made labels for when even that is too much.
I have a whole video on how to make a quilt label, and I'll leave a link to it here.
When I was making garments, heck, just life in general as a working mother, speed was always front and center. And I knew that skilled seamstresses could put pedal to the metal and produce amazing results. This one took me also years to discover that that wasn't the best strategy for me in quilting. Not only was sewing too fast affecting my accuracy, it often caused me to go over multiple layers too quickly, so my points didn't line up, my blocks were distorted, and my seam allowances would twist. And when I timed my Stash Buster 2 quilt, a viewer asked me why. Shouldn't the experience be about making two? That comment made me take a step back and reevaluate my thoughts on speed. Now, when I'm making a test block, I note how the fabric moves through the feet and the needle. I see which parts of the seam I will need to slow down to accommodate thicker fabrics. And I find the spots where I just might need to stop and adjust. And then I move the speed button on my machine accordingly. And honestly, I truly enjoy quilting so much more now that I'm not rushing. I'm staying in the moment and appreciating the results. You might think that this is an odd one because I'm a YouTuber, but this is another one of those I'm not quite good enough thoughts. I wasn't a good enough quilter, let alone a good photographer. And most days, I just don't have the bandwidth for a carefully curated social media feed. But photos are not just for Instagram. I make quilts for others to wrap them in warmth and love. And a large percentage of them I will never see again. And I realized that I had made so many that I had no tangible memory of. So now I'm trying to take photos of my sewing space every time I sit down at my machine. Which fabrics and tools that I'm using, the blocks that I'm making, and the design wall for how it's all coming together. And I'm just keeping them in their own folder on my phone as an archive that I can enjoy and share when I have a moment. I have always found the transition from making a quilt top to quilting the top quite challenging. And of course, the moment that I need them, every quilting technique that I know just evaporates from my mind. So then I'll default to straight line quilting or a pantograph. But after I participated in an online forum, I found that this is a common problem with long armors, and it's just not unique to me. So I stopped rushing to push myself through it. When you realize that you need a whole different skill set to quilt than piece, it makes sense that it would be hard. So now I'm following their advice and just waiting for the quilt to talk to me, which is maker speak for just allowing my brain to take a break, switch gears, and run through an archive of techniques. It then becomes a negotiation between what I want to do and what I have the skills to do. And sometimes I do straight line quilting or a pantograph, but now it's a choice that I'm happy with. We often bemoan our less than stellar results, but a wise person once told me that it's only a mistake if you don't learn from it. So be kind to yourself as you practice your craft and grow as a maker. I have a whole playlist of tips and tricks for better results. Just click on that thumbnail there. And if you want to watch my series on color, I'll leave a link there too. Take care, and I'll see you next time.